City of Salem Finance Committee to order. I'm Tom Anderson. I'm a city councilor and I am the chair of the Finance Committee. We've got lots of people here today. We're filling the screen. So I would ask that the two councilors, beginning with the lowest number ward, announce themselves.
Hey, Virginia Stapleton, Ward 1, and I just got news from Jose. He'll be here in about 15 minutes, stuck in another meeting.
And I'm Trevor Phillips, counselor for Ward 3.
And somebody on the staff, could you just announce when when Jose shows up? Okay, I called the meeting to order, and the first item is to approve the minutes of the October 25th meeting of this year. We have a quorum here. The chair recognizes that. We got 1/2 + 1. So do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move.
Second.
Okay, and I believe we can just take a voice vote. All those in favor of the minutes of being approved, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Minutes are approved. Now, we are a public meeting and we have the opportunity to have members of the public come and address the Finance Committee on any matter they so desire, as long as it has $ in front of it. Is there any member of the public here who would like to speak with the Finance Committee? Going once? That's enough. Okay, now we are on action items, and I'm looking at you, Josh, and I'm pretty sure we don't have any action items.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, so now we are going to the management update information items. We are going to get a report from the ESG investment strategy, and I will turn that over to Josh, and then the folks who are here to present to us, and I see one right below me.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Jenny. She's been coordinating with PFM on their response, so she'll be walking us through the subject this evening.
Thank you. So in preparation for today's meeting, we provided agenda item 5A. So that begins on page 4 of the packet. So in this report, we provided an overview of some of the things we discussed last meeting related to the ESG investing strategy that PFM offers to their clients. And that's a solution for clients who are looking to employ measurable non-financial factors into their investment decisions. And in this report, we also provided 3 possible approaches to implementing an ESG strategy. So PFM will provide further information on the mechanics of how the ESG investing strategy works. They'll also provide some details on how ESG scores are calculated, as well as an overview of the city's current portfolio and how it might perform under a revised investing strategy. And you'll notice that their discussion and presentation will kind of mirror the 3 approaches we included in the staff report. And we also asked that they provide an estimate for what this would cost to engage in the additional services. And so after PFM has a chance to do their presentation, our goal would be to understand whether the committee would like the city to pursue these additional advisory services, and then kind of go through the next steps and timeline, which are included in the background section of that staff report. So I don't know if there are any questions or if we're ready to kind of turn it over to PFM.
I have one. I just want to say I cut my screen because I had all my notes out in the car in my briefcase. So I ran out to my car to remember that my car is not here. So you folks will be lucky because I will not ask all the questions I thought I was going to ask. All right. Sorry. Take it away.
Yeah. So Dave or Lauren, I'm not sure if you want to go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. I am going to turn it over to my colleague, David Reeser. Dave, as we know him. He is going to share his screen, or actually Allison's going to share her screen and address the items that Jenny had outlined in the staff report. So without further ado, Dave, who's head of our ESG strategy group here at PFM, is going to kick us off.
Thanks, Lauren, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you again. So we have prepared a follow-up presentation from our previous discussion on October 25th, during which, if you recall, we just provided an introduction to ESG investing and talked a little bit about PFM's approach to employing ESG investment strategies for our clients. Allison, if you could go to the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. So, so where are we at this point? Well, as I just mentioned, we have spent some time talking about ESG investing in general. This discussion is going to kind of focus on three different subjects. First, we're going to spend a little bit of time on the ESG risk evaluation methodology that has been developed by Sustainalytics, which is the company that we work with to implement these solutions. And then we're going to spend some time talking about an ESG risk assessment of the city's investments that are managed by PFM Asset Management. And then from there, we're going to talk about the ESG investment strategy options and the impact that those strategy options would have, or what we think they would have on the city's universe of eligible investments. I would encourage you to ask, any questions you have along the way, of course. And I would just like to highlight that the first section is a bit technical. So if whatever I'm trying to, the points I'm trying to make are not entirely clear, please, let me know that so that we can work through them. Next slide, please, Allison. Thank you. We can go to the next one. Thanks. So I think a good place to start is just to talk about who is Sustainalytics exactly, and what is the ESG risk rating? Well, as described on this page, Sustainalytics is a global company. They've been providing ESG data and analytics and research for over 25 years. They've developed a pretty significant database of organizations that they evaluate from this perspective. It's grown to something like 14,000 public and private companies. They are now a subsidiary of Morningstar as well. Morningstar did own a minority share of the company for a number of years, and then they bought the rest of Sustainalytics. I think it was last year they completed that acquisition. And Morningstar has adopted the Sustainalytics framework as well for purposes of providing sustainability ratings on ETFs and mutual funds that that they evaluate through their system. The ESG risk rating system is designed to enable investors to evaluate different organizations from an ESG risk perspective using a consistent methodology. It uses a kind of a scoring methodology that then indicates a level of absolute ESG risk that an organization is exposed to. And just as a reminder, these are risks that in Sustainalytics' view could have a significant impact on the financial and operating performance of a company over time if those risks are not, are not effectively managed. But it's a scale that goes from 0 to 100, and we'll talk about this along the way. But the way to interpret the kind of the raw score is that a lower score represents less ESG risk. So it's a kind of a better outcome for an organization. And in a couple of slides, you'll see that within this 0 to 100 scale, Sustainalytics has created kind of 5 different rating categories to provide an indication of the level of risk for each company that it rates. Next slide, please, Allison. So, let's talk a little bit about how ESG risk exposure is determined. So we talked about the fact that Sustainalytics does evaluate a pretty substantial universe of corporate issuers. We talked about the fact that it's over 14,000 companies. So so the way Sustainalytics approaches this is they first categorize those 14,000 companies into one of 42 different industry groups. Okay. Then from there, they assign each company to one of 137 different sub-industry groups. So within those 42 different industry classifications, there are 137 different sub-industry groups. I generally refer to these sub-industry groups, as peer groups. So if you hear me say that, that's what I mean. And it's at this peer group or sub-industry level that Sustainalytics is identifying sort of common material ESG risks, or what they refer to as material ESG issues, that are applicable to each company within that sub-industry. And Sustainalytics has developed a system through which they have created 20 distinct material ESG issues that they examine. However, they don't apply or they don't evaluate, 20 different material ESG issues for each company that they evaluate, but rather based on those 20 material ESG issues, they determine which one of those issues are applicable to each company at the sub-industry level. So for example, a company in the information technology space may have 4 or 5 or 6 material ESG issues that Sustainalytics evaluates, whereas a company in the oil and gas space may have 8 or 9 or 10 material ESG issues that Sustainalytics evaluates. And that mix of material ESG risks will be different. And they'll be different because each of those companies has different types of business operations and of course, different risks that they're exposed to. The other adjustment that Sustainalytics makes is for kind of company specific, or what they refer to as idiosyncratic risks that could also significantly impact a company's ESG risk profile. So Sustainalytics takes a look at each company's exposure to their applicable material ESG issues, and then evaluates how effectively each of those companies is managing that risk, and from there develops a score or a rating, which we're going to talk about a little bit further here. Next slide, please, Allison. So quickly on this page just kind of provides a listing of each of the 42 different industry groups that Sustainalytics has created. So again, within this 42 different industry group, the Sustainalytics has also developed 137 different sub-industry groups. So within each industry group, you could see up to 8 different sub-industry groups, or you could see as few as 1. It really just depends on the industry. Next slide, please, Allison. Thanks. Slide 6 just provides a listing of each of the material ESG issue categories that Sustainalytics has created. You'll notice there are actually 21 on this table. I mentioned 20 earlier. The additional material ESG issue is corporate governance. Corporate governance is applied to every organization that Sustainalytics evaluates. It's just the other 20 material ESG issues that may vary. The other thing you may notice is that that the material ESG issues can apply to multiple environmental, social, or governance pillars with weights that will vary depending on the sub-industry. Just to give you an example, if you look at the table kind of towards the bottom of the table, you'll notice that there is a material ESG issue called product governance. And you'll notice that there is a check mark next to the kind of the social pillar, as well as a check mark next to the governance pillar. There actually should also be one in the environmental category as well. That's just a kind of a small oversight on our part. If you were to look at the material ESG issues for the diversified bank sub-industry, which would include organizations like JP Morgan and Bank of America, you would notice that product governance is a material ESG risk for those organizations. And in the case of organizations in the diversified bank sub-industry, the way product governance is applied is about half of it is governance related, and about half of it is social related. Conversely, if we look at that same material ESG issue for a company in the online and direct marketing retail category, a company like Amazon, you would see that 60% of the product governance material ESG issue is actually environmental in nature, and 40% is social. So I guess my point is that the material ESG issues, again, are kind of tailored to the risks that are specific to companies in each sub-industry group, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So on this page, we're going to spend a couple minutes just kind of talking about how the risk rating is kind of decomposed. So how do we get from the starting point to ultimately the end point, which is the risk rating itself? So if you look at the left-hand side of the page, you'll notice that the starting point is total ESG risk exposure. I know we don't have ESG next to exposure there, but it's total ESG risk exposure. And again, that total exposure is a function of the material ESG risks that apply to each specific organization that has been evaluated. And from there, Sustainalytics determines what portion of that ESG risk exposure is manageable risk and which portion simply can't be managed. For every company typically has some level of risk they simply can't do anything about. A good example is airlines. When airlines fly across the country, they are of course emitting carbon into the atmosphere. Currently, there really isn't anything they can do about that. That is an unmanageable risk. Whereas there are many other risks that are certainly manageable. Occupational safety, the way workers are treated, board diversification, and so forth. Those are manageable types of risks. Now, you will notice on this graphic that the unmanageable risk is part of the ESG risk rating. So that goes right to the ESG risk rating, the end score. And within the manageable risk component, the question then is how much of that manageable risk, is being effectively managed and which portion is not. So the portion of the manageable risk that an organization is not effectively managing is the management gap. So that's the other, and that is the other component of the ESG risk rating. So the ESG risk rating, what it really represents is unmanaged ESG risk, which is comprised of unmanageable risk and the portion of risk that could be managed, but is not being effectively managed. Councilor Anderson, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. Thanks. So what you're really saying, Dave, is some of these bad acting corporations actually can change. So if they have managed risk that they're not managing, and all of a sudden they're losing investments in their company because they are not managing it, they could maybe decide, well, we're going to manage it. Is that a correct analysis?
Yes, it is. Certainly, the companies can do a better job of addressing certain risks, which, as I just described, are certainly manageable. Whether it's companies that have high levels of environmental exposure or other companies.
Let the chair note that Councilor Gonzalez is here.
Thank you.
I also I think this is good because we don't want to be seen whatever we adopt as saying we are punishing you for this. We are giving them an opportunity to see the error of their ways and change. You don't have to comment.
No, I understand your point.
Not a
Right.
social issue. Then the other question I have, and maybe you'll get to it, but airlines and automobile industries, are they included in the fossil fuel sort of categories that we talk about in scenario 2 and scenario 3?
They actually are not.
Why not?
That is just in the examples that we've provided. We have focused exclusively on companies that are involved in the direct production or
Got it.
distribution of fossil fuels, as opposed to organizations that use fossil fuels.
Thank you. That's a good distinction.
You know, if you're interested in a broader environmental approach, that is something we could talk about.
Quick question for you, Dave. You said that we just talked about how companies could maybe get into a better position for these kinds of investments. How often are you reviewing companies?
Thank you for that question, Counselor. So we do update our kind of universe of metrics at least on a monthly basis. So we go through a monthly, basically a monthly process where we download not just risk ratings, but a whole host of other metrics that we do evaluate, both internally and of course on behalf of our clients at the end of each month. It's actually part of the process that we employ when we execute ESG strategies for our clients. The part of the way we do that is, based on, we use those updated ratings at the end of each month for decision purposes the following month.
Yeah, thanks.
But just to follow up on, on my response to Counselor Stapleton, the ratings themselves, they're not constantly changing. And to the extent we do see changes, they tend to be, modest from month to month. The exception is typically when Sustainalytics does kind of a deeper evaluation, which they usually do annually on a company. After that evaluation is completed, we may see a more meaningful either upgrade or downgrade, of course, to a company's ESG risk rating, depending on on the changes that company has made in terms of managing their ESG risk.
Thanks, Dave. While we have an interruption here in your presentation, I suspect Counselor Gonzalez doesn't have any questions yet, but I'm wondering if Counselor Phillips has any questions, and then we'll move right back on.
Okay.
I don't think I have any questions that are specific to the slides that are in front of us right now.
Same
Very
here.
good.
Thank you, sir. Thanks.
Allison, next slide, please. Thank you. So on slide 8, where you're going to walk through an example of an ESG risk rating. And in this case, we're walking through this example for Chevron. So again, starting with total ESG risk exposure, and based on a scale that goes up to 100 points, with higher numbers representing greater ESG risk exposure, you can see that Sustainalytics has determined that Chevron's total ESG risk exposure was 72.6. This was as of November 19th, so this was a very current rating. Of that total ESG risk exposure, in Sustainalytics' view, most of that risk is manageable, and a portion of it, about 15%, is unmanageable. So you can see that in the breakdown in the second column. And then, of course, in the third column, you can see the determination of what portion of the manageable risk has been effectively managed. It's about half of it. And what portion is not being effectively managed. That's the management gap. So if we add the unmanageable risk and the management gap, those two numbers equal Chevron's ESG risk rating of 41.2. And you can see at the bottom of this page, we've provided the risk rating scale. You could see 5 different rating categories. which range from negligible to severe risk. So, Chevron's just barely over the severe risk threshold. I can tell you that most organizations typically fall within the low to high range. Very few fall within the negligible range. And, there's certainly a certain percentage in the severe range, but not a real high percentage, just so you know.
Okay, I'm contradicting myself. I do have a question on this slide, if it's okay with the chair. So is it a coincidence that the ESG risk rating for the example listed on the slide is the same as the number under unmanaged risk?
No, those are intentionally, and they're intended to be the same exact number because the risk rating represents the unmanaged risk.
Okay.
Yep.
So, I mean, if the managed risk, help me conceptualize that though. Like the managed risk is less. I mean, what if it was a lot less, or what if it was like 39? Does that play in? How does that play into the overall risk rating? Like, why isn't it as important or weighted or whatever?
It's a good question, Councilor Phillips. So if the managed risk number was higher, that would indicate that Chevron is doing a better job of addressing their ESG risk exposure. And as a result, Chevron's ESG risk rating would be lower. Okay, so they would fall, let's say within the high or medium risk category as opposed to the severe category. Conversely, if they were not performing as well as they are from an ESG risk management perspective, their risk rating would be higher. So it would be even kind of more severe, if you will.
Did I miss anything important? I'm helping my wife drive. I don't think I did, but I have a question, Dave, and that is, manage risk or still risk? I mean, you don't manage them away. What you're saying is they're doing the best they can, but they are still they're still resulting in a risk of some kind.
Well, yes, it's a risk, but they are managing it from Sustainalytics perspective effectively. So let me give you an example. Okay. Let's go into kind of the governance category. If you accept the fact that a lack of board diversity, at the kind of the governing board is a risk.
Yeah.
And the organization is doing a very good job of ensuring appropriate board diversity, then they're effectively managing that risk, right?
Okay. Let's look at another one.
Sure.
As long as we're talking about Chevron, and I may have the country wrong, but Chevron and oil companies are doing horrible things in like Nigeria and other African countries, and they're not managing that. They are polluting the water. They are polluting the fishing industries. They are paying people non-livable wages. They're doing all sorts of social things that are not correct, at least in my view. So is that a managed risk? Is that an unmanaged risk? Where does stuff like that form? Go.
Risks of the type that you just provided examples for would likely fall under the unmanaged risk and would be additive to the risk rating. Allison, would you mind going to the next slide, please? So this will provide a different viewpoint of the ESG risk rating decomposition for Chevron. And in this example, what we're providing is each of the material ESG issues that Sustainalytics has assigned to Chevron, as well as Chevron's performance within each of these material ESG categories. So there are raw scores for each of those issues, as well as the gray bars that go all the way out to the right represent how much ESG risk exposure Chevron has to each of those risks. And then you can kind of see how they're performing within those categories. So carbon output obviously is a big issue. And that's the biggest issue that Chevron has. They are, of course, emitting tremendous amounts of carbon, as well as they're a high user of emissions, or they're high emitter, of emissions, high creator of waste. But then in categories like community relations and bribery and occupational health and safety, they are performing okay, but they have a ways to go. And they're sort of being, they're being looked at from other perspectives, like Counselor Anderson just cited, how they manage human capital. In other words, how are they treating workers, kind of ethical practices and so forth. So, there's a lot of value judgments, quite frankly, in any of these systems, whether it's Sustainalytics or any other ESG data analytics providers. But we feel comfortable and confident with this approach because it's been, it's backed by a company that's been doing it for so long. Plus, the methodology is relatively, it's complicated, but it's relatively logical and it's very thorough.
Dave, quick question. The numbers on this slide are in no way related to the numbers on the other slide.
Actually, if you were to, that's a good question, and thanks for bringing that up. If you were to actually, Counselor Phillips, to add up each of those numbers, they would equal the ESG risk rating for Chevron.
Okay, so they are related.
Yes.
So, I mean, on this, is it, so when you get the total risk for the example here of 72.6, which one of these categories are by definition based on the industry, like unmanaged, or you can't, I mean, there's the, I'm missing my words, but.
What portion's unmanaged and what portion is not?
Yeah.
I can't tell from looking at this chart. I'd have to go back into the system and take a look at Chevron's report to figure that out.
But theoretically, somebody could have, like, all of their carbon could be managed, but in the case of fossil fuels, that would be extraordinarily difficult.
That's right. Yeah. I think it would be difficult no matter what, but in the case of an oil and gas company, it's impossible. I think, at least right now, based on current technology.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm starting to understand the math better. Thank you.
Yep. Counselor Anderson.
One other question. I mean, I added all those up roughly and they come to 41.2, which is what it is. But my question is, where do we get the 71 or the figure that Counselor Phillips was using? Because 71, they'd be way up in severe, but 41.2, they're just over the border.
Yeah, the 71, we didn't provide those numbers here, but if you were to kind of roughly look at each of these, the endpoints of these gray bars on this page, I don't know what each number is off the top of my head, and add those up.
Got it.
That'll get you to around the 72.
Yeah, I see the total exposure is 72.6, and that's the managed risk is 31.4. Subtract that, and you get to 41.2.
Right.
But that still leaves the fact that the managed risks are still producing harm. It's just that they're doing the best they can. Correct.
Arguably, they could do better. Right.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to be nice to them.
Yes, but this is, again, this is kind of where they rate at the moment.
Okay, so are they rating at 41.2 or the total exposure is 72.6?
It's 41.2.
Okay, then I guess my other question is, who would be up at 100? Who would be up at 72?
I haven't seen any issuers, certainly no issuers on PFM's approved issuer list that are anywhere near that point. I'm not sure. I would have to take a look at the entire universe of rated issuers. I wouldn't expect you would see many, high quality investment grade type companies like we're talking about here with that terrible of a risk profile, right? But I could be surprised.
Hey, Dave, is the risk exposure set by the industry or is it specific to the company?
It is specific to the company, based on the material ESG risks for that company's sub-industry group, which are being applied to that company. Okay. As well as any other, which I don't think there are any kind of what are referred to as idiosyncratic risks that might be applicable as well.
A large contributor is just the industry they're in.
It really is. I mean, ultimately, this is a function of business operations and business activities, which are driving the types of risks that any company may have. So, we're using Chevron. You guys have Chevron in your portfolio, so I thought it would be interesting to talk about Chevron. If we were to look at this same profile for a really high quality, from an ESG perspective, company like a Microsoft or an Adobe, that we would see a very different risk profile. And in both cases, those companies would end up in the low risk category.
So Dave, if we go to number 2 or number 3, Chevron's out?
I think they're out in all 3 cases.
Okay.
Counselor,
Okay.
actually, just due to the fact that they have such a kind of a poor ESG risk profile.
Well, as you mentioned Microsoft, as long as we're in this discussion, let's talk about Amazon. I mean, their employment practices are miserable. So maybe they're clean on the environment and socially, et cetera, but I would say their governance is horrible. So where does a company like Amazon fit in? And now I'm making a value judgment, but how do you assess that kind of stuff? They lock their employees in, or look at Walmart, the same thing. Their employees have to be on food stamps because they don't pay them enough.
We're going to get to Amazon here in a couple minutes, actually.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So if you would just bear with me here, hold on. We'll get to Amazon. Allison, if we could go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. Oh, we're going to get in the next section. So before we start talking about the next section, are there any other questions about the ESG risk rating methodology? And I appreciate all the good questions, because that is a very difficult thing to kind of wrap your head around. Okay. So now we're going to spend some time talking about the city's investments that PFM Asset Management manages. Allison, let's go to the next page, actually. Thank you. So this is a good place to start. And what this page highlights is the portion of the city's investment portfolio that we have applied ESG risk ratings to. So you can see that we've applied ESG risk ratings to 15 of 16. So 15 out of 16 issuers within the portfolios that PFM Asset Management manages, and that represents about 30% of the assets. So we're applying these ESG risk metrics to all corporate note issuers, as well as the 3 federal agency issuers that are held within the portfolios. Federal Home Loan Bank, Freddie Mac, or the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, and Fannie Mae. We're not currently applying ESG risk metrics to U.S. Treasury debt. Next slide, please, Allison. So on this page, we can kind of see if you look at the top part of the page and focus on the column chart, that is providing a distribution of the ESG risk ratings within each of the 5 risk categories that we talked about earlier. And you'll notice that about 7% of the portfolio is allocated to issuers in the severe category, 13% in high, and so forth. Most of the issuers in the portfolio fall within the medium and low category. That's good. You'll see that has resulted in an average ESG risk rating for the portfolio that's going to squarely within the medium risk category. So it's right around 25, 24.7. So again, a lower rating actually represents lower ESG risk overall. We also think it's useful to just get an idea as to what the average total exposure or starting point is for the portfolio. So in the case of the city's investments, the total average exposure is about 44. So again, within kind of the medium range, that's actually a pretty good starting point, relatively low exposure actually on average. And we also like to report on the average kind of management score. And what the management score is indicating is it's sort of measuring how strong management practices are for each company in addressing their specific ESG risks. So the management score is the one score that is sort of flipped in terms of how you interpret it. A higher score actually represents better management, and a lower score actually represents worse management. So again, 47, that's generally where we see a lot of portfolios kind of in the 45 to 50 range. So again, not too bad a starting point.
Question again, Dave. So let's say we get rid of the severe and high. I presume then our exposure would get lower and our management would get into the strong category.
Well, it would certainly improve the risk rating itself, and it would improve the risk distribution, and it would probably reduce the average exposure score a bit as well. It may not improve the management score though, Counselor. In some cases, I've seen many companies that are in the high risk category or even the severe risk category that have pretty decent management scores.
Sure, it's the product that they are using or producing it.
Right, right.
Companies run. Okay, sure.
Exactly. Allison, next slide, please. Thank you. So on this page, we're going to take a little bit deeper dive and evaluate the city's investments through the ESG theme framework that we've created. We kind of created this framework and to sort of group some of the material ESG issues that we talked about earlier, just to make it a little bit more digestible, but also so that we could go a little bit deeper into the output. And what we're doing here is we're providing in the top left-hand corner kind of a reconciliation of the risk rating as allocated to each of the 3 ESG pillars. So if you were just to break down the raw score, again, the average ESG risk rating of the portfolio is 24.7. You can see that the smallest component of that risk rating is attributable to environmental risk, and the largest component is attributable to social risk. And then governance risk represents 9.6 points here. And then we're also indicating what the contribution to risk is by theme within each of the 3 pillars in the kind of the donut chart here below, right? So you could see that about 15% of the portfolio's ESG risk is environmental in nature, with more than half of that related to carbon output and energy use. That's not surprising given the holdings in the portfolio. In the social risk category, this is pretty typical for many of the portfolios that we evaluate. A lot of the risk falls within the human capital management and product governance categories. Human capital management is taking a look at issues like human rights and labor rights, inequality, how companies manage talent development and employee retention and labor health and safety. So it's comprised of a number of different socially related indicators. Same with product governance. Within that category, we're evaluating product quality, safety issues, wellness. We're also evaluating data privacy and cybersecurity, which are not just big issues for IT companies, but they're big issues for every financial services company, probably just about every company these days, quite frankly. So it's pretty typical to see a lot of the social risk fall within those 2 specific themes. And we really don't split out corporate governance. We just haven't felt the need to. But in the case of corporate governance, we are, of course, taking a look at things like how the companies develop rules and policies and practices related to governance, ethical standards, lobbying activities. We talked about board composition earlier, pay policies or remuneration, if you will, and shareholder rights. So again, we're sort of taking a pretty broad look or a holistic evaluation of the portfolio's ESG risk, and not really getting too focused on one specific issue. Pause there just to see if there are any questions before we talk about slide 15.
I have lots of thoughts, but they all go into the weeds because that's just my personality. So I'm going to stay with you up here at this level and not dive into some topic.
Well, I think that's very appropriate because I have thoughts too, and they're probably the same, but we're getting the information from Dave and Lauren and everybody else, and then we have to make the policy decisions. So if we kind of understand this, I mean, the way I look at that, if we got rid of carbon and energy use, we're cutting the risk in the environmental area basically by half. But is that a correct reading, Dave?
I can't remember the weighting of, of Chevron in the portfolio, but you would reduce it certainly.
Sure, I understand. We're not going to get rid of everybody because some
right.
people will have that. And then
every company has some, or almost every company has some level of environmental risk. I mean, it takes energy to run any business, right? And it's just it takes other resources to run many businesses, and there's just very little you can do about that.
I'm just speaking now again in a policy sort of perspective. I'm much more concerned about environmental risk and social risk than I am about governance risk, except to the extent that governance risk, how it affects environmental and social risk. But that's my view of things.
Okay. So let's move on to slide 15, and this will kind of get back to Councilor Anderson's question about Amazon. So on slide 15, we're providing more details with respect to the ESG risk assessment for each of the issuers that we've evaluated. And the way this table is organized is it's sorted from lowest ESG risk rating to highest ESG risk rating. And we're providing, of course, the issuer on the far left-hand column. The column labeled percent weight represents the size of the investment within the city's investment portfolio. So how much of the portfolio is allocated to each of those specific issuers. And you can see which sub-industry category, which Sustainalytics sub-industry category each of those issuers falls in. And the next column that is titled sub-industry percentile. The way to interpret that number is, again, a lower number represents better performance within the peer group. So Microsoft is in the top 3 percentile of performers within the enterprise and infrastructure software sub-industry. So they're doing an outstanding job of managing their ESG risks. Whereas at the bottom of the table, to get back to Councilor Anderson's questions about Amazon, you see Amazon is at the 91st percentile within their sub-industry group. They're kind of at the bottom of the list. There was a time when they were actually at the bottom of the list. They've actually improved a little bit. They were literally at the 100th percentile for quite a while, but they have gotten a little better. And a lot of their issues are within the governance category, if I remember correctly. And you can see we are providing the risk rating as of October 31st, which we've talked a lot about. And then the last 3 columns are indicating the percentage contributions to the risk rating that are attributable to each of the ESG pillars. So in the case of Microsoft, 6% of their ESG risk is environmental in nature, 57% is social in nature, and 37% is governance in nature. And you can see how those contributions, the mix of those contributions really varies depending on the sub-industry category for each of these companies. So not surprisingly, Toyota and Chevron and even a Procter & Gamble have much higher levels of environmental risk exposure due to the kind of more manufacturer nature or carbon intensive nature of their business operations. Any questions about page 15? Okay, so I think we're ready to spend some time talking about ESG investment criteria options. And I think we can go to the next page, Allison. Thank you. So these 3 options are in the same order as the options that in the memo that Josh and Jenny and the team prepared for you folks. So we looked at 3 different ESG options. All 3 approaches, of course, use ESG risk ratings and ESG metrics as kind of the key risk evaluation tool. In the case of approaches number 2 and 3, we're also incorporating exclusions for investing specifically in any company that's involved in the direct production or distribution of fossil fuels. So in the case of option 1, the criteria has 2 components. The first component is to limit issuer ESG risk to medium or lower. So in order for an issuer to be eligible for inclusion in the portfolio, they need to maintain medium or lower ESG risk. However, because there are certain companies that are just in higher risk exposure sub-industry groups, like we talked about, we have included kind of this exception to allow for companies in the high risk category, provided they are they're within the top 25th percentile of their sub-industry group. This is what we commonly refer to as like a top performers exception. These would be organizations that we think are kind of making a greater or more concerted effort to manage their risk. Councilor Anderson.
Thank you. I have a question about that I expressed to Josh when we were talking earlier today. The eligibility exception for top performers on 2 and 3, does that include any of the fossil fuel industry exclusions? In other words, if you have a fossil fuel industry that is a top performer, do they come in under any eligibility exception, or just all fossil fuels are out?
Under number 1, they would.
Oh, no, I'm asking 2 and 3.
Under 2 and 3, they would not.
Okay.
They would be excluded. So the first criteria that would be applied would be any exclusions. Okay. So if a company is within an excluded sub-industry group or industry group, they're automatically, not eligible for inclusion in the portfolio. Councilor Phillips.
I think I know the answer to this, but I want to verify it. So in this, the slide 17 here, when we talk about top performers, we're not talking about top performers financially. We're talking about top performers within this risk categorization. Okay.
Correct. Yep. Good question.
Dave, the medium or lower is what we're looking for. I'm looking just at all of these in there, but what are we doing right now? Are we medium or lower, or do we have some high, or what's our exposure? Do we have some that, well, Chevron is a high exposure.
You have some high and you have some severe. If we go back to page 15. Okay. Thank you, Allison. Thank you.
Yeah.
The bottom 3 in the table, Amazon's barely in the high category.
Yeah.
At 30. Yeah. And then Toyota's barely as well. And then Chevron's in the severe category.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. Thanks.
Yep.
Dave, quick question. Mm-hmm. So in our last meeting, we talked about doing this wisely and in a very, how do I explain this? Just like a methodical, kind of real smart way of doing this slowly, steadily. Would a method or an approach to doing that be like starting with approach 2 and then slowly working to approach 3? Is that how some people would do something like that? Or is this just, this is what we're going to do for this idea? Does that make sense?
Yeah. One of the benefits of the approach overall here, Councilor Stapleton, is that it maintains the flexibility such that the city can change it at any time. So if the city decides, we would like to start with, as you just provided as an example, approach number 2, and then you decide, no, we really would prefer to make the ESG investment criteria a little bit more conservative. Let's go to approach number 3. That's a pretty easy change for us to make on our end. And it's simply a function of, updating the investment policy language related to the investment criteria, and for us to just adjust the approach on our end. So don't feel like, once you make a decision, you're sort of stuck with it, so to speak. You're certainly not by any means. You have the ability to modify it at any time in the future. You know, more than once, of course. It's not a one-time modification either, for that matter.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Yep.
Dave, just real quick, a little more context. If we did modify the investment policy, there is some that would again have to be modified by the finance committee, go to council, and then to the state board.
Okay.
So
there are a couple steps.
I wouldn't recommend often changing it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Jose, you got any questions?
No, none yet. Thanks.
You understand this so well, Jose?
You know, no, it's pretty, I like the way the information is being presented.
Yeah. No,
And yeah, no, I'm liking it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
and I presume, Dave, I know you did this, but in the rush of all the things that were happening to me, I presume you tell us, I know there was you tell us what the cost of this us in terms of, I think it was like $20,000 if we went to the top one in terms of how much we'd have to pay you. But is there going to be any breakdown on the cost of, or the risk of what we get from our investments? I'm really looking at that between number 2 and number 3. I mean, I would presume that we're better in terms of our return on investment. We may be better off with an eligibility exception. Would that be correct?
Let's talk about that. Well, let's first go to the next page and we'll get to those questions. Those are great questions. So I thought it would be helpful to just walk through an example of how we would apply the ESG criteria to the city's investments. And we're going to use, just for illustrative purposes, approach number 2. So just as a reminder, the ESG investment parameters related to approach number 2 are as follows. I mean, it should be, number 1 really should be the industry exclusion. So, you know, if a company is in any of the excluded fossil fuel industries, they're just simply not eligible.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the other 2 criteria that we talked about related to ESG risk ratings. You know, either A, you know, a company has to have a medium or lower ESG risk rating to be eligible. And second, if a company does not maintain a medium or lower ESG risk rating, let's say they're in the high risk category, but they are a top performer within their sub-industry group, they may also be eligible. Now, of course, this assumes that any company satisfies all other city investment policy requirements. So just keep that in mind. You know, they're satisfying all of the investment, credit rating requirements, and that PFM has fully vetted them from a credit perspective and approved them for investment. So we're starting there. So in this example, you can see that we had 3 eligible issuers. They all satisfied the city's investment policy requirements. Of course, Apple has a low ESG risk rating, so they're satisfying the risk rating requirement. Chevron's a fossil fuel company, so they're immediately off the list just for that reason. And Amazon, excuse me, is in the high risk category. So they could be eligible for inclusion. The problem is that Amazon rates really poorly within their sub-industry group. So they are not satisfying that sort of top performers exception that we talked about. So as a result, the only issuer in this example that would be eligible for inclusion in the city's portfolio is Apple. And you can kind of see that in the little funnel graphic on your left. We're kind of putting all 3 of those companies into the funnel, and the only one that kind of comes out as being eligible is Apple, because they're satisfying all the criteria.
So what if somebody satisfies 1 out of 3? Is that going to make them eligible? They've got to have 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 3.
Well, in this example, they can't be a fossil fuel industry as we've defined it. So we get past that, then from there, they have to either satisfy criteria number 1, in which case that works. If they don't satisfy criteria number 1, they need to satisfy criteria number 2.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Next slide, please. So this kind of speaks to Councilor Anderson's questions regarding the impact that any of these approaches would have on the city's ability to achieve its investment objectives, of its safety and liquidity objectives, of course, as well as its return objectives. And we think it's important to examine, the impact that any of these strategy options will have on your universe of eligible issuers. And you can see that in this case, the impact's kind of relatively minor. So the way to interpret the chart at the top is that based on the city's investment policy requirements and PFM Asset Management's approved issuer list, there are 82 different issuers that we could invest the city's funds in that meet, the investment policy requirements again, and that we feel comfortable, in investing your funds in. When we take into consideration each of the 3 ESG approaches that we discussed, that number drops to is either 74 issuers or 73 issuers. So it's really only a reduction of about 8 or 9 issuers, depending on the approach that we're talking about. And of those 8 or 9 issuers, 3 of those issuers are simply due to the fact that we just don't have ESG metrics for every issuer. It is a significant database of issuers that we receive this information for, but there are a couple that we just don't have metrics for yet. And if we don't have ESG metrics, then we really can't treat them as eligible for inclusion in the portfolio if we're applying an ESG strategy. One of them's in the insurance industry, and then it's oil and gas producers. There is one oil and gas company that is in the medium risk range. That's why in the case of approach number 1, you're seeing a 3 instead of a 4. And the one retailing, which actually I think is Amazon, when you think about it. So the impact on the city's ability to achieve its diversification objectives is really not significant in this case, under each of those approaches. And if we go to slide 20, we've also looked at this from a slightly different perspective, which is to evaluate the same impact within 2 different issue type groups. We combine commercial paper and certificate of deposit issuers, and then we treated corporate note issuers separately. And you can kind of see the breakdown in the impact in the number of eligible issuers after we take into account each of the 3 ESG strategy options that we've been talking about. So again, not significant. Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you. So can you go back 1 slide?
Mm-hmm.
Are these 8 or so folks, 9 folks that we're looking at, are those our top performers as far as return on our investment?
I can't answer that off the top of my head. What we have observed is that we have observed that there hasn't been a meaningful difference in performance between investment grade indices that incorporate an ESG approach and their investment grade non-ESG counterparts. We actually kind of did a research study on that issue, and that study did focus more on kind of the full investment grade universe as opposed to a AA or better. But when we have looked at it in the past and focused just on the AA or better sector, we have observed similar results as well. Okay. Typically, we're not seeing meaningful yield differences. I mean, I think that's really what you're getting at, and that's the bottom line. It's not like you're seeing a 10 or 15 or 20 basis point yield premium to invest in a Chevron or an Exxon Mobil at this point. I'm not saying you won't at some point. If investment managers follow through with what they've been talking about, which is to really start withholding capital for companies like that, one would suspect that the rate of return that those companies need to offer investors will have to be higher at some point. But you also have to keep in mind that PFM would only invest 1, maybe 2% of the portfolio in those issuers. So if you're talking about 1% times, let's say it's a even if it is a 5 basis point advantage, 1% on 5 basis points is going to be essentially zero. But that's a great question. I think we can go to the next slide where we've talked about costs, impact on costs, as well as diversification, which we already discussed, and return, which we already kind of discussed as well. So PFM is proposing an additional fee of 1 basis point. The way we charge it is just on the total portfolio. The reason we do that is it kind of keeps the accounting a little cleaner. It would get very complicated otherwise. We're charging 1 additional basis point on the total portfolio that we're applying the ESG strategy to. In terms of custody and trading costs, you really wouldn't see any change there. It's not going to impact custody or trading costs at all. It's not like we will trade more, which would increase trading fees, and it should have zero impact on any custody related fees. We talked about diversification. We don't think any of the approaches that we've discussed will have a meaningful impact on the city's ability to achieve its diversification objectives. In terms of performance, the performance is more likely to be impacted by traditional investment-related factors, portfolio composition, duration positioning, credit quality mix, and so forth, and really less so about ESG. I think on the next page, we do provide a breakdown of the additional fee. And we compare the additional cost of applying an ESG strategy with the fee the city is currently paying PFM Asset Management. And I think Councilor Anderson, you did point out that it's, or maybe Josh, you pointed out it's an additional $20,000 per year.
And that's $20,000 on what's our complete investment portfolio, Josh? How many millions of dollars do we have? At least set out the U.S. bonds, except for Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae. I'm kind of surprised that there are risk on one of the other ones, but what is the total investments that might be affected by an ESG strategy? And then let me also ask Josh, is the fee that PFM is proposing, that's just industry standard, I would presume? You could answer that, Dave, if you want to tell me that while Josh is looking up the dollar amounts.
I don't know that there really is an industry standard, Councilor Anderson, with regard to ESG fees.
No, I just meant by, okay, I see what you mean.
But it is consistent with the fee that we do charge other clients, absolutely.
Yeah,
which is typically 1 to 2 basis points, depending on size of the portfolio.
Sure.
And since the city's portfolio is relatively, it is a bigger portfolio that we manage. We are on the low end of our fee range.
Okay. And all that is you're going to have to do a little more work at your end to make sure that you're following the ESG guidelines.
That's correct. So there's a team which I lead that provides this service. We work through our monthly process to kind of evaluate all ESG metrics that we compile for each of the issuers on our approved issuer list. We coordinate with our trading operation, our compliance team, our investment services team on implementation each month. And we also provide reporting and training, and we're here as a resource to you. It's not just a matter of us implementing the strategy and never talking to you folks again.
That's why you're here right now. That's why you're here right now.
Right.
Now
it's an ongoing relationship.
Well, good. And I hope so. And I appreciate that it is. And Josh, do you have the figures yet? Or I've got another question.
At the end of September, $185 million. And that includes the U.S. Treasury. Without the U.S. Treasury, about $35 million.
So 35 million. And we're increasing, if we go to the higher one, we're increasing our expenditures by $20,000 on a $35 million investment. the $35 million is real money, according to Everett Dirksen. The $20,000 you can find in your couch, in the back of your couch, I would guess, as with respect to that much money.
I don't know if it's quite that easy, but yes, I get the analogy.
Yeah.
I just to understand the slide 22. So the cost in additional fees is about the same whether it's option 1, 2, or 3.
That's correct. We're not proposing a different fee for each option. We're proposing the same fee, 1 basis point for each of the options. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay.
Dave, it might be helpful to talk about the reporting too. The reporting is also the same for any of the options that are proposed.
That's right.
In addition, so that's ESG reporting in addition to the quarterly performance reports we prepare for the city related to, just the investment strategy. This is an additional component. The ESG reporting would be separate and apart from that.
Right.
I think I'm going to ask a question that probably doesn't have an answer today, but I can hope. When other municipalities are considering this, do we see any trends? Like, are they picking more analogous to the option 2 of 3 today, or are they going, option 3 of 3 today? Or do we have that data yet?
We're still kind of compiling our data in that area, but in general, it really depends, Counselor, on each organization's preferences. And what I mean by that is there are several organizations that we do work with who, like the city, would like to exclude fossil fuels. So that's a pretty common request to incorporate a fossil fuels exclusion. We have a couple of clients that have taken that a bit further and incorporated environmental type risk metrics too, or risk thresholds into their criteria. They just don't want to include, what I mean by that is they don't want to allow issuers with higher levels of environmental risk in general to be eligible. So we've developed a solution to achieve that objective as well. And then we have the other end of the spectrum where we have clients, that are just more focused on a broad-based holistic ESG approach and less concerned about exclusions. And it really depends.
I got a question, 2 questions actually, and this one is pretty obvious, but we've got no investment at all in gun manufacturers.
That's correct. You do not, and I can tell you that there are no gun manufacturers on PFM Asset Management's approved issuer list either.
Perfect. Then I'm a little, you were talking about environmental exclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing that? And if we would go to 2 or 3?
The approach that I was referencing is not incorporated in 2 or 3. However, 2 or 3 certainly do reduce your environmental exposure just through the fossil fuels exclusion.
So why isn't that approach mentioned or utilized? Did we not give instruction? I mean, did you need more instruction from us in that area?
We could certainly look at it and share that information with you after this call.
Yeah. And
if you're interested.
Well, I'm interested. I don't know, but I'd like to hear from the rest of the committee. Trevor?
I'm somewhat interested. The devil would be in the details. I think, what's been presented here is kind of like between 2 and 3, I think is my preference in terms of policy, at a minimum to create the just straightforward fossil fuel exception. Beyond that, I would like to see what, the additional exceptions that are specifically in the environmental category look like before I could really comment on my opinion.
And Virginia?
Yeah, I'd have to echo Trevor. I was actually really surprised that, the difference between, as far as excluding folks, the difference between 2 and 3 was only 1. Was it only 1? Or
I think so. They might be the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're the same.
Because sorry, Trevor. I was nervous about going to 3 But then I saw that and I was like, oh, I shouldn't be nervous about that at all. But any other kind of additional information, that would always be welcome.
Jose?
Yes, if we have that additional information, that additional analysis that you requested, Tom, then I think, yeah, it'll just sort of round out sort of what we've been talking about.
And Josh, is that something that could be done within our ongoing relationship with Dave and the fine folks there?
Yeah, and I think we can, if you go to the slide that shows our current portfolio, I think you can get an idea of the environmental risk. So the E there, I mean, you can see the ones that would already be excluded, the ones at the bottom. The one that wouldn't be, I think, that could, if you had an exclusion, would be the Procter and Gamble.
Yeah,
It might be.
Yeah.
The way we approach it is we take a look at the each issuer's environmental risk contribution score, or the kind of the raw score that's attributable to the risk rating. So, for example, if Procter and Gamble, if the environmental component of their risk rating is like 10, for example, that might be above, an environmental risk threshold, which is, is up to you guys where you would set it. And as a result, maybe they are no longer an eligible issuer.
Well, just looking at this right now, I mean, Procter and Gamble is the huge outlier there of the ones above the bottom three. Is there any way we could just incorporate Procter and Gamble as an exclusion merely based on that 37%, or would we have to do some policy or get some report back from you?
I would be, the percentages can be a little deceptive. And what I mean by that is you can have a company that has a really terrific or low ESG risk rating. That could be, let's say 10 to 15, but let's say it's 10, but three points or 30% of that risk rating is environmentally related. I would encourage you not to exclude a company like that from your eligibility list just because of a percentile, which is why we don't approach it that way.
And does Procter and Gamble, does that fit the example you just?
I'd have to look. Actually, you know what? I have the numbers up here.
And Counselor, I wouldn't recommend excluding a specific company.
Yeah, no, I agree. We're having a wide-ranging discussion here, Josh, and I agree. In my field, that is known as a bill of attainder. That's the kind of law where you pass it, direct it to one particular person as opposed to broad classes of people. So you got the numbers here, Dave?
You have to bear with me. Oh,
okay, while you look
bear
at
with
that,
me a second. Oh, here we go. I was on the wrong spreadsheet. My apologies. There in Procter and Gamble's environmental contributions about 10.
Okay.
It's right around 10.
Okay.
Typically in the past, we've set that threshold at about 7.5.
Okay.
But again, that's something the city can decide whether or not it wants to move forward.
And so that, by what you're telling me there, it seems to me that we're addressing the main component of environmental and the fossil fuel exceptions. So I think we're really, as a committee, now looking at door number 1, door number 2, door number 3.
Right.
And Josh, so I'm asking you now, Josh, as a process matter, and I see we're just before 5 o'clock. And we don't have a council meeting till 6, right? There's no executive session or anything else. I'm looking at the other counselors.
That's correct.
Okay. So we've got a little time here. I'd like to be done no later than 5:30, and if we can do that earlier, that's better. So it seems to me that what you need from us now is a recommendation for you and PFM to come back with a potential policy that we could discuss one more time and then pass on to the city council. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We'd come back with language changes and a red line version for your consideration.
Okay.
Right.
Well, just to get going then, and the chair can move, I'm going to move that we adopt door number 3. And, well, I'll make that motion and we have to have a second.
Second.
Okay, and the reason I do is for the reasons that that Virginia said. It's in terms of the panoply of where we can do our investment. It's about the same number of 2 or 3 are about the same number, and it doesn't really cost that much more to us. And there was one other issue that made me think that, gee, 2 is like so close to 3, we might as well go whole hog here. That's a legal term.
Melissa,
So-
could you show the options again? Sorry,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so discussion by the group.
Yeah, I agree with Chair Anderson. When I saw that there's no difference in terms of eligibility between 2 and 3, I feel like 3 makes sense. And I think that that is what the spirit of other things that are happening in the city governance in terms of consideration of the Environmental Action Task Force recommendations would probably lean us towards. So yeah, I'm comfortable with 3, and I'm a lot more comfortable after these excellent discussions in the last 2 months of meetings. You know, thanks, Dave, for the presentation.
Thank you.
Jose,
No further discussion for me.
okay, Virginia,
Yeah, likewise. I think I stated it earlier, but I am really comfortable with 3. And I think, like Councilor Phillips just said, it aligns well with what we're trying to do. And I really like getting out of that high risk percentile area and bringing it down to that medium and low. That feels really good to me.
okay. So if there's no further discussion, I will ask the recorder to poll the committee on the motion, which is to have the staff come back with ESG approach number 3.
Member Stapleton,
Aye.
Member Phillips,
Aye.
Member Gonzalez.
Aye.
Chair Anderson.
Aye.
Thank you.
So I'm looking, do we have any continued business, Mr. Eggleston?
No, not for this evening.
Okay, is there any new business? All right, well, having had that, I want to thank everybody on the city staff and on PMF for your presentations, and it's just really, really helpful to us as decision makers and policy makers to understand the whole range of where we're looking here. And your reports were very easy to follow and understand, and I appreciate all the hard work you've done, both PMF and the staff. So thank you very much. I am prepared to adjourn this meeting, and I'll see some of you in about 55 minutes. Thanks a lot. Bye.